So, welcome everybody to Robert Whitaker's conference. So, I'm honored to present him. He's a journal. Well, most of you surely know him, and I count him as a friend, and I'm very lucky to have come across him, um, and I've learned so much. And so, what can I say? He's the author of Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullet, Psychiatric Drugs, and Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness, and Mad in America, The Mistreatment of, well, it's a long title, so I remember it, but it impacted me, that book. And he's been researching on this topic and topic on medication. So it's going to be very interesting because we haven't had that many conferences on this topic till the moment. And so we're very, very happy to have you with us, Robert, and the whole committee welcomes you. And so thank you so much for your time and your generosity. And the floor is yours.
Okay,
and welcome everyone.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Claudia, and to everyone who's organized this conference. As I was saying, I only wish we could be meeting in person. I think when you have a chance to meet within person, it's such a more valuable experience, learning experience. But anyway, this is the second best. So thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to show some slides. I thought maybe I'd speak for around 40 minutes and then we can have some times for questions. When we start talking about psychiatric medications, there's always a lot of questions. So I want to make sure there's time for that. I'm going to share my screen here. So I thought I'd start by explaining why I got interested in open dialogue and traveled to Finland, which is where I met Jaakko and others. When I wrote Anatomy of an Epidemic, after I sort of went through the research literature, I became convinced that the research showed this. If you really wanted to maximize the possibility of recovery from psychosis and maximize best outcomes, you needed to use antipsychotics in a different way. You needed to use them in a selective use model, which actually tried to minimize initial exposure and minimize long-term use. So that's what I drew from the research literature. And then I came upon the reports by Jaakko reporting about what they had been doing in open dialogue. And that's precisely the model of use of antipsychotics that they adopted in the 90s and kept at least for a number of years. And just as you might predict from the literature, they had very good outcomes, much better than you saw with conventional care. In fact, it really was a transforming of the picture of what was possible. So once I went up there, I became interested in, okay, what is open dialogue therapy? I just want to say for me, the most important thing was here was a model where they were using antipsychotics in a different manner. They had a record of good outcomes. And so for me, it was like a confirmation of what I drew as a conclusion from the research literature. And just, so really there's sort of two questions around this. I just need to do something here so I can see my own slides a bit better. There's really two questions to address on this. One is, what does the scientific literature tell us about the possibility of recovery without neuroleptics? And when we talk about this question, there's a lot of confusion historically between schizophrenia and psychosis. We separate them more today, but if you go in the literature, there often is an overlap. So sometimes that's a bit of problem with the literature. And then the second question is, how does the regular use of neuroleptics affect long-term recovery rates? Because of course, the general paradigm of care is you use the drugs immediately, and then you keep people on the drugs. I'm talking about psychotic patients. And you do so, you have this maintenance therapy to lower the risk of relapse. Now, you will notice in that long-term literature that there's no evidence that actually tells you that you're improving the possibility of really having a robust recovery. It just says we're preventing or lowering the risk of relapse. So we'll go through these two questions pretty quickly. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, just one thing. I just got to change my view. Okay. So we're going to do two things. We're going to go back into history and look at what were outcomes for patients treated with basically a non-biological model, but instead an environmental model. If we create a better environment for people, what sort of outcomes do you see for, now, if we go back to the 1800s, people were labeled insane. But if you look at the case reports for people coming into like the moral therapy asylums in the early 1800s, these are really disturbed people. They certainly would get the psychotic diagnosis today. Okay, you can see that, and think about this. There was a lot more tolerance for, eccentric people, etc., in the 1800s than there is to today. So these people are on the end of that. Well, the real seed for change and it serves as such an example for us today, came from the York Retreat in Northern England. Now, if you were around in England in the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, they had a lot of, we had the Bedlam Asylum, etc., and people would be chained up. They would be treated with harsh somatic therapies. If you read a medical text of those days, it was about bleeding people, making sure that people feared you, that sort of thing. The Quakers said this after one of their members was treated in this way: we don't know what causes psychosis or insanity, but we do know these people are children of God, and therefore they have a God-given capacity often to recover. So there's this inner capacity to nurture. And second of all, if people can't recover, we still have a duty to treat them as brethren. So really the big switch is a conceptualization switch from under the medical model, under the time, under the madness. People who descended into madness were seen as going into a lower level of being because it was reason which separated humans from the animals. So they were treated often as animals. The Quakers are reconceiving things. They're saying, no, they're children of God and they have this God-given capacity to recover. They set up their retreat in 1796. They kept very good records. And what did they find? For first episode patients, insane patients, that was the label at the time, 70% recovered, and they went back into the community and they never needed to come back to the retreat. So they were able to function well enough in society that they had a regular life and a robust life. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't eccentric, they weren't difficult at times. It just means they could function in society. And even patients who had been seen as chronically ill that they took out of these, like the old Bedlam Asylum, that came to them, 25% recovered. So this became an example of environmental care. And by the way, this was by ordinary people. It wasn't by doctors at the time. Could be a route to sort of regain your sanity with great frequency. Now, in the United States, we had Quakers here, and they began opening moral retreat asylums in the early 1800s. The largest one was at Worcester Asylum. Worcester is a town outside of Boston. And they did a follow-up of all their patients who were admitted to the hospital, this retreat, from 13 years. And what did they find? They found that 58% remained well throughout their lives. They were discharged and remained well. 7% were discharged but relapsed, came back for a time and returned to the community. And 35% became chronically ill. So just remember this note, 65%. By the way, what was the form of care in a moral retreat asylum, like at York Retreat? First of all, they would, diet was important. Nice shelter was important. Exercise was important. They would go for walks, work in the garden. And the biggest thing was this. They said, they removed the whips. They didn't try to use violence, that sort of thing. And they said, we try to hold up a mirror to the newly insane that reflects back not the image of a mad person who can't be in society, but rather the image of someone who can, so they would dress well. They would eat 4 times a day. They would have teas. There was a reading room. So rather than treat people as mad and unable to organize their own lives, they said, no, we're going to treat you as ordinary people who can regain the capacity to organize your lives and that sort of thing. So it's an environmental form of care. So this was another sort of hospital that was founded on this principle. Now, by this time, they were getting doctors to come in to manage these facilities, but still, it was this idea that environmental care places out in nature could be places of a return to recovery. And they went back and looked at all the insane patients admitted during these 40-year periods. 45% were discharged as cured, 25% were discharged as improved. In other words, 70% were discharged and returned to the community. Now, we don't really know what cured might mean, that sort of thing, but it does mean they were able to go back into a society and function there. And many people, of course, would, if they were women, they'd have children. Fathers would be, men would become fathers. They had to work. Now, many of them, I'm sure, remained seen as eccentric, sometimes difficult, but nevertheless, you see here a 70% rate where they could leave the hospital and return to some sort of functioning in society. Now, what happens after this period? We get a eugenic period. Eugenic ideas take hold, and this really just happens in the United States initially, and then we export it, or the ideas actually take hold in other countries, the Scandinavian countries and all. The idea with eugenics that was promoted was that the mad were mad because of a genetic disorder, and they even said it was a single gene disorder. And therefore, what society needed to do was take people who, quote, have this gene, even though they didn't know what gene it was, but if they had these symptoms supposedly of insanity, and remove them from society and keep them there so they couldn't spread their bad genes in society. So what you see, eugenic ideas take hold in the late 1890s, early 1900s in the United States, and you see discharge rates just go dramatically down. But that's not a reflection of the possibility of recovery or getting better from an environmental supports or nurturing environments. It's a reflection of a different conceptualization of what was going on in the people we call insane. And that conceptualization led to the idea you have to segregate these people from society. So for our purposes, we want to look at after World War II. Now, because after, Hitler, of course, Nazi Germany really adopted eugenic ideas. They had a sterilization program, like in the US. It was the mentally ill who were first killed in the Holocaust. But then at the end of World War II, two things happen. One, eugenics basically becomes discredited because of the association with Nazism. And two, in the United States, for example, we had a lot of returning veterans who weren't doing well, but because they were seen through the eyes of servicemen, the idea became, they were suffering from something that happened in the war. They have the capacity to get better if we can nurture that capacity. So it sort of restores the idea that if you have a timeout and a place where people can be, given some safety and that sort of thing, that they can go back to society. And so what you want to look to do at is, because 1955 is when chlorpromazine, which is remembered today as the first antipsychotic, arrives in asylum medicine. So we have this 10-year period when we can look at discharge rates before the arrival of antipsychotics. And what do you see in place after place? You'll see if you look at first episode patients, because by this time there is a chronic population that's in the hospitals, you see again and again that discharge rates within 1 year are anywhere from 60 to 65%. And if you go even longer, you're seeing discharge rates of about 85%. In other words, of those who came in as first episode patients, the vast majority would regain enough ability to function and organize themselves, they could return to society. And by the way, this is before there's any disability payments, social support services. They were going back to work. If you actually look at employment rates, most people discharged would go back to work, or as a domestic, because in the United States, at least, women weren't entering the workforce so much after the war. You'll see this in Warren State in Pennsylvania, Delaware State, and also you'll see better stay well rates. Look at how many are living in the community at the end of 3 years. And again, this is when there's no social support. No one's on disability. Okay. And you'll see it's around 70%. So we're starting to see again, if we went back to this first episode of eruption of, quote, insanity, psychosis, schizophrenia, whatever we want to call it, that there is often a majority of patients that can get better over time, and that able to function in society is going to be around at least 2/3 before the arrival of antipsychotics. And you'll see this again in Norway. It's the same thing, basically. 15% in the hospital at the end of the study. There's 9% that got discharged and came back. But look at those discharged and not readmitted. 64%. They had a time of psychosis. They had an episode of psychosis, but they didn't. This is not a sign of people becoming chronically, quote, schizophrenic. And that's one of the real messages to sort of draw from this review of the history, is you want to try to have some understanding is, if we look at people coming in with the first episode of psychosis, what is the natural course of outcomes? What is the possible spectrum of outcomes? With the current model of care, we say, oh, you're going to be destined to be sort of chronically ill for life. You need this medication, otherwise you'll become psychotic. What the past tells us is that is not true. There's a much more optimistic sort of evidence base to grab onto here. And by the way, when the drugs came in the United States, California decided to do a study. They're going to look at hospitals. This is in I think it's 1956, 57. And they're going to, 56. They're going to look at all their first episode patients, and they're going to look at them and treat it in places that had adopted use of chlorpromazine, and then those that had yet to introduce them into their regular care, and see what were the discharge rates for the two groups. And what do you see? You actually see higher discharge rates in that year for people not put on neuroleptics, antipsychotics. What did the researchers conclude? The drug-treated patients tend to have longer periods of hospitalization. The untreated patients consistently show a somewhat lower retention rate. Now, forget about the comparison here. Just again, this is a nugget of information telling us that there is a capacity to recover from a psychotic episode and really stay well. It's not going to be happening to everybody, but it can happen to a large percentage of people. So I just gathered here all these different studies. I went over and look at the good outcomes. We've done these real briefly, and you'll see good outcomes really generally are around at least 2/3. Okay, with the Pennsylvania hospital, if you have people still functioning, it's at 70%. Okay, so just remember that from the past. Now, we're not going to have time really to go through all of these, I don't think, but I went through all the studies that basically have this comparison in some way, other than relapse studies. What happens with relapse studies, you take people who have stabilized on the drugs, then you take one group off rather rapidly, the other group stays on, and with great regularity, those taken off do relapse at a higher rate. But that's not a medication naive group, that's a group going through drug withdrawal, okay? And that group that has adapted to the presence of the drug. So this is something different in these studies. And watch what you see with great sort of historical regularity. A pattern is so important here. This was the first, quote, well-controlled placebo study. It was done by the National Institute of Mental Health. It has 4 arms. 3 groups are treated with drug in the hospital, the 4th in placebo. They're discharged. Then they follow them up at the end of 1 year, and they notice that those who were treated with placebo upon initial hospitalization were less likely to be rehospitalized than those who received neuroleptics. So right at the beginning, there's this hint that maybe the drugs increase relapse rates over time. It's just a hint, okay? Next, you had someone at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, Samuel Bachhoven, who did a study. He says, okay, I have data from 5-year outcome data from people treated as a first episode in 1947 for 5 years, and I have a similar group in 1967 treated with the same psychosocial care. The difference is the 67 group was given antipsychotics. What did they find? Actually, relapse rates were a little higher with the modern group, but more important was the difference in functional outcomes. 76% were successfully living in the community into 5 years of 47 cohort. That's the pre-drug cohort. And now they're much more socially dependent on welfare, et cetera. And you'll see here, rather unexpectedly, these data suggest that psychotropic drugs may not be indispensable. Their extended use in aftercare may prolong the social dependency of many discharged patients. The reason I'm quoting here, and I'm going to have to not quote all of them, but I want you to see what the researchers drew in terms of their conclusion from their own research data. Now we have 3 studies done in the 1970s, funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which are supposed to reinvestigate this question of, are these drugs really making for an advance in care, particularly over the long term? The first was done by Maurice Rappaport. He's in California. Here's how the study was designed. It was a randomized study. People come into the hospital with an episode of psychosis. They're either randomized to no meds, or to antipsychotics. Then they're discharged. And then once they're released, it becomes a naturalistic study. So let's say I'm randomized to no meds. Do I stay off the medications for 3 years? That's the no meds off. But if I'm randomized to no meds and I go on, you'll see that's a separate group. So what do you see here? You see by far the best outcomes in the 2/3 of patients, 24 out of 41, randomized to no meds, who were then able to stay off the meds for the 3 years. This is a never exposed group. What do you see? Low rehospitalization rates. And in terms of severity illness, these people are doing quite well. Okay. What group is doing the worst? It's actually probably antipsychotic on, the group that's actually following our paradigm of care today. But even no meds on is not so great. Now, of course, the explanation, right away you can say this. At the very least, there's a chance, if you look at first episode patients, a fair number can get better. Okay, that's what you see out of 24 out of the 41. But what explains the sort of seemingly difference between the antipsychotic on and the no meds off group? Anyway, the researchers looked at, well, maybe it's just a question of difference of severity of illness, that sort of thing, and they did not find that to be so. That wasn't an explanation. What's happening here? My computer just froze. Anyway, what Rappaport says, findings suggest that antipsychotic medication is not the treatment of choice, at least for certain patients, if one is interested in long-term clinical improvement. So this is the first NIMH study in the 1970s, and they're saying we have to rethink this. Greater long-term improvement, less pathology at follow-up, fewer rehospitalizations, and better overall functioning, okay? Now, second, William Carpenter, who's still a big name in schizophrenia in the United States, he did a study at the in-house NIMH facility where it was randomized. People either are randomized to off drug or to continual care over the year. You'll see those treated without drugs were discharged sooner. They had a lower rate of relapse within a year, and the unmedicated group also suffered less from depression, blunted emotions, and retarded movements. Now, here is what they described, what the patients said, what it was like to go through psychosis without having their feelings numbed by a drug, and how they interpret it. And I'm going to go ahead, I'll give you time to read it, because I think this is such a fascinating explanation for what they saw at this time. So as you read this, you're hearing a sentiment that sometimes patients today express, which is that if they can bring their full emotions and their full cognitive sort of capacity to this time of psychosis, it can actually be a transforming experience, and they almost feel stronger, more able to function, cope as they come out of it. And that's what you're seeing in this 1977 study. Now, Lauren Mosher, by the way, the importance here is these were 3 studies done by the NIMH by leading researchers designed to assess in the 1970s, are we making a mistake with this paradigm of care where we medicate and keep people on regularly? Lauren Mosher, we're head of schizophrenia studies. He did something called the Soteria project. It was at least quasi-randomized. People came into the hospital where they were either treated conventionally with drugs, or they were sent to a house out in the community, which was staffed by ordinary people, not actually by psychiatrists. And the idea was that being in a community where you were expected to cook, communicate with others, that sort of thing, just you were being given both the opportunity and the responsibility to start fitting into a social situation, that could be nurturing. By the way, it was led for 10 years by Boyce Hendricks, who is the cousin of Jimi Hendrix. And one of the reasons I think was successful because Boyce was such an exceptional individual. Real quickly on a study example, how they would handle psychotic thoughts. One of the stories that was told to me is there was one person there who had the idea the delusion that the UFO was going to come and take him out into outer space and he needed to go meet them. So rather than say that was a delusion, voice said, okay, when are they supposed to come get you? The guy said, this night at this park. So they drove to the park. They spent the night there. And as on the way home, the person said to voice, well, I guess they decided not to come. And you can see there, that's a very different way to handle sort of ideas that seem out of sync with reality. Anyway, at the end of 6 weeks, by the way, here was the use of antipsychotics in this. Initially, no, they didn't put people on antipsychotics. If people weren't getting better, they would use a low dose. And then after people were on, they would see who could taper off, so it wasn't continual low dose. With that model of care, by the way, at the end of 6 weeks, psychosis had abated just as much in the Soteria group. At the end of 2 years, the Soteria patients had lower psychopathology scores, fewer readmissions, and better global adjustment. Antipsychotic use was a global selective model. 42% had never been exposed to the drugs, 39% temporarily, and 19% used them regularly. When we go to open dialogue, look at their selective use model and how it breaks down. You'll see something not too far off from this. Why is this always, there we go. And I need to go faster on this, but he's saying the same thing. We need to re-examine the risks and benefits and risks of using antipsychotics. It appears it's not harmful to have this selective use model, but appears to be advantageous. This was the head of schizophrenia studies. Now, one other study during this time was done by the World Health Organization. They compared outcomes for schizophrenia patients in the US and 5 other developed countries with outcomes for schizophrenia patients in 3, quote, developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia. In both countries, it was the developing countries where outcomes were much better. And they were diagnosed, by the way, by Western doctors. You'll see they had a considerably better course. They concluded that being in a developed country was a strong predictor of not attaining a complete remission. We were doing something wrong. Exceptionally good social outcome in the developing countries. What was the medication usage? After the first one, they hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is they're more medication compliant. So they measured this and they found that the drugs in the poor countries, the developing countries, were used acutely, but not chronically. They didn't maintain patients on the drugs. And then the researchers went back for 15 to 20 years. And what did they find? Big outcome differential. In the developing countries, 53% were never psychotic anymore and 73% were employed. So again, you see in this data, the idea that for many people, an initial onset of psychosis can be episodic, not chronic. Now, just so you know, in the 80s and 90s, a biological explanation was put together by starting out of Canada that said this is the reason antipsychotics worsen long-term outcomes. And it said the drugs block dopamine. In response, the brain increases its dopamine receptors. That puts the brain into a dopamine supersensitive state, and that leads to greater psychosis and tardive dyskinesia and that sort of thing. So there was a biological explanation put forth at the time to try to explain this seemingly contradictory outcome you saw in the 70s. Now, the best long-term study we have that's just going to follow the clinical course or the life course of people diagnosed with psychotic or schizophrenia comes from Martin Harrow, who's a psychologist, and Tom Job, who was a psychiatrist at the University of Illinois. Their study went like this. They get 200 patients, they're enrolled into their study, and they're either going to take them from a public hospital or a private hospital. That way they get a diverse range and class of patients. Everybody's going to be treated conventionally in the hospital. They're going to be discharged, and then they're just going to be followed for, they'll follow them up at 2 years, 4.5, 7.5, 10, 15, and 20 years. And each follow-up, they're going to see, are they taking antipsychotics? Have they been in the hospital? How symptomatic they are? They're going to measure a lot of things. Are they working? That sort of thing. So it's going to be, and are they taking antipsychotics? Okay. Their hypothesis was that it would be the medication compliant patients that stayed on the drugs regularly would have the best outcomes. So here's the group of patients they ended up with. At 15 years, they were still following 145 patients. They followed them out into the community. 64 were schizophrenia, 81 had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, 81 had milder psychotic disorders. You'll see some are bipolar, etc. Now, the beauty is median age was 23, 46% first hospitalization, 21% only one previous. So the 2/3 of their patients are getting them early on in the course before like maybe a chronic course is set in with the use of medications, okay? So what happened? They were shocked. By the way, to be in recovery, you had to be asymptomatic and you had to have a good social functioning as well. You had to be working or in school, okay? Now, at 2 years of the schizophrenia patients, roughly 25 had taken themselves off. They just took themselves off, okay? This wasn't a tapering thing. Now, these who took themselves off disappeared because once they took themselves off, they weren't doing what the psychiatrist wanted. They disappeared into the community. And the beauty of this study is these researchers followed them into the community even after they dropped out of care. Now, you'll notice that at 2 years, only 20% of those off medication are in recovery versus only 10% in taking the drugs. But look what happens between year 2 and 4.5 with it on this graphic. What do you see? You see the capacity for recovery and really sort of full recovery in those who've taken themselves off. And this is without support. This is people just going back to the community. On the other hand, you don't see people staying on medications doing well. They're not recovering. I mean, a small percentage are 5%. Anyway, this is an 8-fold higher recovery rate. Why is not this? Something's going on. Come on. There we go. I'm going to do this quickly. They measure anxiety symptoms. Same thing. Look what happens. Those who keep on taking their drugs, they become more anxious between 2 and 4.5 years. You get a real relief of anxiety for those who come off, stay off. Cognitive function is better at every follow-up for those off antipsychotics. Now, this is a really interesting chart. You have one group. Yeah, there was 25 that were mostly off antipsychotics, but every once in a while they go back on. But there was one group that was off by year 2 and never went back on. And you'll see at one point, only about 10% were still having antipsychotic, but 70%, 68% just, oh, sorry, I'm reading this wrong. The red is the group that's antipsychotic compliant, and you'll see that they remain psychotic, okay? Like 2/3 are remaining actively psychotic, even though they're on the meds. Look what happens to the group off the drugs. 68% are psychotic still when they first go off. It's not like they got better and went off, but once they went off, they got stable. Only 23% at year 4.5. And look at 10, 15, and 20 years. Very few have active psychotic symptoms. This completely belies the idea if you come off your meds, you're going to be immediately relapse. What happens is in this naturalistic study, a lot of people stopped going to care. And then once they were out of care during this time, the psychosis abated. Work history, those who didn't use antipsychotics during follow-up, look, almost 90% were working versus 23% always on antipsychotic. They also looked at a time thing. How much more likely were you to be in recovery at any time during this study from 2 years on? If you were off antipsychotics, it was 6 times more likely. And this is the spectrum of outcomes. You'll see that it's not just that the recovery rate was 8 times higher, but those with a uniformly poor outcome, only 16% had that uniformly poor versus half of those who were on antipsychotics. And remember some of those pre-1955 data where you sort of have recovery, discharged and doing okay, and then sort of chronically ill. This is the off antipsychotics is reflecting, I think, that sort of natural course of outcomes. Because remember, this isn't within care. This is people who basically left care, the off antipsychotic group. And here's what Martin Harrell concluded. You never hear it, but this is funded by the NIMH, the best long-term study done in recent times, significantly better global functioning than those on antipsychotics. So what I've shown you here is over and over again, the conclusions drawn by those who did the research. This is not my conclusion that I'm putting on their research. It's their conclusion. Real quickly, so this is like bipolar with, or, milder psychotic disorders. You'll see that those off antipsychotics had this, by the way, is a really good outcome. I mean, in terms of on the scale from 1 to 8. So these affective disorders off antipsychotics, this is a very good outcome. Now, here's a really interesting chart. So the affective disorders should have a better prognosis than schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a diagnosis we give for those with a poor prognosis, and they've been supposedly psychotic for 6 months. Look what happens. Schizophrenia off ends up better than affective disorders on. So those with a worse prognosis in the beginning, schizophrenia off, end up better than with affective disorders on. That completely belies it's the excuse often given, oh, it's just those with a better prognosis who got off and did better. It's just not true. You can see here between those comparisons, schizophrenia off and affective disorders on, there must be some agent that's causing this switch in long-term outcomes. That's just a summary of those who stayed on antipsychotics: more psychotic, more anxious, worse cognitive function, lower recovery rates, more likely to have uniformly poor outcome, had worse global outcomes. Then there was a randomized study where they took people who stabilized on antipsychotics. One group is discontinued or either goes down to a very low dose. They follow them for 7 years. The other group is maintained on a regular care. You'll see that having the opportunity to go through this tapering doubled the long-term recovery rate. Now, during the time after that tapering, of course, some of those people in the discontinuation arm go on to they readopt to having regular care, and some of those who were randomized to regular care nevertheless took them off. So this is just outcomes at 7 years by antipsychotic use: more symptom remission, more functional remission, more full recovery. This is a 10-year study in Denmark. First episode, this is nice. At the time of recruitment, patients had been on antipsychotics less than 12 weeks. There's still 300 patients in the study at 210 years. Now, everybody is supposed to take antipsychotics, but roughly 1/3, they become non-compliant. They stop taking the drugs. There's no difference between those who drop out at baseline scores characteristics than those who stay on. Here's the recovery rates. Outcomes at 10 years. More likely to be in remission, more likely to be employed. Okay. There's a Finnish birth cohort study. I'm going to skip this, but basically it was a study where they looked at people born in 1966 who then get diagnosed with schizophrenia at some point, how they are doing in year 2000 at year 34. And it was the group that was off antipsychotics that was doing much better at age 34, much more likely to be in remission, employed, married, and less likely to be on disability. Australia did this 2-year study where first episode patients are stabilized. Now they say, oh, we got to keep people on. So they randomized to one group, ordinary care, and another group that gets this enhanced treatment to make sure they stay on their drugs. And the enhanced treatment did increase compliance. However, the increased use of medication was associated with decreases in psychosocial functioning and increases in negative symptoms. German survey of schizophrenia patients once again found that those off medication long-term, significantly higher levels of general functioning, and that the longer they had been off, the higher the level of functioning. Now, this is the open dialogue data that Jaakko published in 2006. I know he's done updated reports from this. This was what I gathered when I was getting ready to report on this in 2010 for Anatomy of an Epidemic. And sometimes the grouping of numbers of patients ends up a little different. But at this time, what did you see? Of 75 patients of outcomes for 5 years. Schizophrenia, there were 30 with a schizophrenia diagnosis, 45 with an other psychotic disorders diagnosis, 67% with their form of care at that time. And with their form of care at that time, with first episode patients, they weren't immediately put on antipsychotics. They might be given a benzo or something to sleep if they couldn't sleep. And as long as a person's grip on life was improving, they were showing the ability to come into dialogical sessions, that sort of thing, they would hold off on putting them on antipsychotics. If at some point they thought it could be helpful, they would say, would they ask the person if maybe they thought it would be helpful? They give the antipsychotic, usually a low dose, and then at a later time, if those exposed, they'd see who could taper off successfully. So what do you see? Never exposed to antipsychotics, 67%. Do you recognize that figure, 67%? Something we heard over and over again when we tried to look at the natural sort of possibility without exposure to antipsychotics. You have this other group that used the drugs, sort of as a crutch at some point, and ongoing use at into 5 years, 20%. So you really see in here like an 80% good outcome number, and 20% moving into that chronically ill category. And you see again, with this form of selective use, 80% asymptomatic at the end of 5 years, 67% never relapsed. Look at the functional outcomes with this selective use model. 73% working or in school, 7% unemployed, only 20% on disability. This is dramatically different from outcomes with the ordinary paradigm of care where you medicate right away and you try to have maintenance use of antipsychotics. Now, Jaakko presented this at a conference in 2016 and just looked at psychotic symptoms based on antipsychotic use during the first 2 years. You see those who had no use of, now this is a measure at 5 years, who didn't use antipsychotics in the first 2 years. Look at it, 85% are not having symptoms. So what you see here again in this chart is this capacity for psychosis really to be an episodic disorder, not a chronic disorder. And by the way, the reason I was interested in and this, we'll get to the 19-year outcomes. When I went up to Finland and to talk to Jaakko and went up to Tornio and all, I viewed open dialogue through this lens, that they had found a way, to keep people safe during that initial time of psychosis. And they had therefore, second of all, they had found a therapy, much like I think moral therapy did, that amplified the natural capacity to recover. And one of the things I even saw in common with moral therapy is my understanding of open dialogue, rather than present to the person a picture of someone who's going to be chronically ill and is deficient or defective. They present a picture of someone who can be with others, and they can build a narrative for going forward where they rejoin friends, have jobs, etc., which is very much what moral therapy, the Quakers, reflected back to their patients. Anyway, this is the 19-year outcomes. You'll see that in their form of care, open dialogue, only about a third, a little more than a third, almost a little more than half used antipsychotics at some point. At the end of the study, only about a third, a little more than a third. You'll see lower rates of hospitalization, much lower rates of disability, and even their mortality rate was lower too. And this is conventional care within Finland. So you have still the same culture that this is the background with. So what I take from this is that, from my point of view, and I have been focused on the use of medications, that open dialogue therapy really needs to be married to this selective use model, where you try to actually minimize initial exposure if it's possible, particularly with first episode. And then if you do use them, you see, you use them for a time at low doses and then see who can taper off them successfully. And you're likely to get this sort of grouping of people who can have just a time of psychosis and recover without the drugs. Another group that needed to be on the drugs for a time, but is doing pretty well at the end, functional. And then there's a group that's sort of destined to become chronically ill. But that's a lot different from what we're seeing today. That's what I just talked about. Here's our outcomes today. This is recovery rates internationally. Since 1996 is when the atypicals arrived. And it's also when we began a lot of polypharmacy. The recovery rates for people with diagnosed with schizophrenia is now lower than it's ever been. And it's dropped since 1956, 1975. Global function over time. This was a big study in Long Island. What's interesting about this is people really medicated, treated in clinical care. Look what happens after 4 years on the drugs. You start to see this sharp decline in functioning. And you see that mortality rates, standard mortality rates for schizophrenia patients have actually increased since 1980. And in particular, since 1996, where we got the atypicals. At least in the United States, where polypharmacy is so prevalent, you'll often see in the United States people on 5, 10. It's just, it's just a lot of drugs. All right, that's it. That's a little fast. Sorry I went fast, but I wanted to make sure there was time for questions. And the bottom line message is, I think, an optimistic one. It's a message about when a person has a psychotic episode break, there's plenty of chance they can have a time of psychosis and get their lives back. I know many people that's happened to. And in terms of medications, antipsychotics, you really need to use this in a selected manner. That's my opinion, because this is telling of a maintenance form that is not letting many people really regain their lives. And I think what we're doing with that form of care is converting people who could have had an episodic time and converting them into, chronic patients. And last thing I'd say, I look at this study. It takes time. The problem is it doesn't happen necessarily in 6 weeks or even 6 months. You can see a long arc of recovery here. Now, this was not in a form of care that amplified that recovery. And in the Soteria project, it was pretty good at 2 years. But it doesn't mean, if you fall into psychosis, it can be a difficult time coming out. But what we need to recover, in my opinion, and I think the whole, dialogical therapy effort is to recover that sense that this can be an episodic problem. And if you treat people in a way that from the beginning recognizes that possibility of recovery, you can achieve such outcomes. And then finally, I do worry that open dialogue therapy is adapted and incorporated in other countries. There's not enough attention paying to this element of the form of care that flourished in Tornio from 1991 or 1990 to 2010, and maybe a little bit later. All right, thanks.